Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you how to replace the front busk if you had warped or broken your front busk here. So in previous videos I showed you how to possibly repair a broken busk peg. I'll put the link up in the cards if you want to watch that one. I also showed how to just take out the busk completely and replace it with front lacing. But today I have found a matching busk, brand new, that actually fits this busk properly, so I can show you how to replace your busk. So the damage you see here, I'll show you a close-up. So this busk loop is warped, and this one is actually a little bit down. This one is twisted and a little bit up. This one seems okay, and this one is ever so slightly twisted as well, a little bit downwards. And on the other side here, you can see that this busk loop is completely gone, and one of these is a little bit wobbly. Yeah, this one is wobbly. So this is the result of not loosening the laces before you take off the corset. Please remember that you need to remove the laces every single time, because I've spoken with professional corset makers that have almost indestructible corsets themselves. If you put the wrong kind of tension on the busk and you're like twisting and warping and just going like that and really struggling with it, even the best quality like Vissner busks from Germany have the risk of breaking if you're not using it properly. So please remember to unlace every single time you get out of your corset and then undo the busk afterwards. So there are a couple of things you need to know before you just go out and buy a new busk to replace it. First of all, the length has to be the same. So in this one, the length is actually 7 inches. And you want to fold back the fabric a little bit and feel for the tips of either end. It's not going to go all the way to the very top and bottom of the corset, or rarely anyways. With off-the-rack corsets, they're usually a little bit shorter than the full length of the center front. So in this case, it's 7 inches. The next thing you need to know is the width between all the busks and loops. So measuring from the middle of this pin to this pin is about 1 3/4 inches. And I believe it's, yeah, about same for this one as well. And this one as well. So you want to look for a busk that has loops and pins equidistantly spaced 1 3/4 inches apart. If you find a different 7-inch long busk, but the two lower loops are a little bit closer together, it's not going to fit in this corset, because you see you have little holes there, little gaps in the seam to put the loops through. And these are actual, you can see they're puncture holes to fit the pins through. So you're going to have to put in new puncture holes or new gaps in the seam here to fit a busk that has different spacing between the loops and pins. And what happens if you don't get a matching busk length is, let's say that you just kind of measured the center front of this corset, the full center front instead of the busk, and this is 8 1/4 inches. So let's say I have an 8-inch busk here. It's not going to fit. See, there's not enough space at the top and bottom here to put the binding back on. And so it's either going to jut out weirdly, or I might have to just like put a patch on the top or the bottom to accommodate the length of this busk. Or I could cut down the length of the busk. But even if I cut down the length of the very top and bottom, you can see here the distance between the loops and pins don't match up. So if I match it to the very top one, you can see it's just so much longer. So it really is not the best choice here. In the case of this cincher, I did get lucky because corsetmakingsupplies.com actually have a 7-inch busk in stock. And you can see if I put this apart and match it up here, it is pretty much spot on. Another way you can test the fit is take your new busk, put that half there and this half here. Does it match up? Yes, it does. Awesome. So that way we don't have to make any new holes when we put in this busk. And the third thing you should be careful of is the width of the busk, although this can be fudged a little bit. So obviously in this case, it's a standard flexible busk, so it's 1/2 inch on each side. If I were to find a heavy duty busk in the same length, I could just take out this side, this adjacent flat steel bone. I don't need those flat steel bones anymore, and I could just place the busk in this width here, and that would be okay. I would just have to remove that seam right there. Or if your corset has a heavy duty busk on each side, like 1 inch on each side, and you're replacing it with a standard width busk that's only half of that width, then obviously you can shift over the seam and you can add adjacent bones next to the busk if you need that extra rigidity and support. So the most straightforward thing that you could do if you intend to replace the busk yourself is to go back to that same brand or maker and ask them if they have any more busks in stock, or in the case of an off-the-rack company, if their factory might have any of the same busks in stock that they might be able to sell you. Barring that, you might have to just look around on Etsy or any other corset supply stores and see if you can get lucky and find a matching busk. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually remove the laces from this corset, because it's easier to work with each half of the corset individually as opposed to trying to pick out the seams or running through the sewing machine, balancing like the other half of the corset on my lap, just kind of hanging there from the laces. So I'm just going to take these out. The next thing I'm going to do is undo the binding, and like I showed in my shortening your overbust video, when it comes to a longer corset, it's actually easier to undo both the top and the bottom seams of the binding, so that for these pins up here, you can get your hand in from above, and the lower pins you can get your hand in from below. But with a cincher like this, I'm going to try and only do it by one. And because this seam is curved at the bottom but it's straight at the top, I think that later on when I'm putting on the same binding again, I might have an easier time putting this on cleanly and neatly. So I'm going to choose to undo the top of the binding instead. And I'm not undoing the entire binding, just probably the first panel is enough space to work with. Okay, so you can see that I've undone the binding just up to the first panel. We'll see if that's enough space for me to work with the busk here. Some of you might be wondering, why did I not just simply undo the center front seam here and then I could just take it out? It's because this is a tension bearing seam. So when you're putting on the corset and lacing it up tight, this is holding an incredible amount of tension, because this is the only thing that is preventing the busk from just ripping right out of the corset. And so I want to keep those seams intact, especially because there's no real top stitch here. It's just the seam in the center front here. That's all that's holding it in place, and there's no top stitch. So if I were to rip out this seam, it would be extremely difficult for me to do up this seam again when I go to put the new busk in, unless I wanted to whip stitch it entirely by hand. If you want to do that, go right ahead, that's your prerogative. But because I'm going to be repairing this by machine, I'm going to be taking out this seam instead, and probably that one too. And it might be counterintuitive to take out two seams instead of just one, but I think I'm going to get a stronger result in the end, and also it's probably going to look cleaner in the end, as long as I can follow right along these seams later on so that there aren't a whole bunch of pinpricks here. So the next step is just to remove these adjacent bones, and they slip out really quickly and easily. If you are working with a corset that doesn't have these adjacent bones, your work is going to be so much easier because you don't have two seams to remove. So because this is not a tension-bearing seam, it is probably going to come out fairly easily. Removing all the seams is by far the longest part in this entire process, so don't be discouraged. The sewing does not take nearly as long. So that's one seam out. You can see the seam right there. And now for this seam. And you can work from the back of the corset. If you have a satin corset, it's probably better to work from the back because then you won't damage the satin accidentally when you're going through this. But it's actually easier for me to see the black thread on the fashion fabric here as opposed to here on the twill. And when you're done with this side, you get to do the same on the other side. Yay! Okay, so now both of these seams are out, and you can see I can put my hand all the way into this first panel, and this slides right out. So I'm gonna put this somewhere far away so I don't get confused between my two busks, because I don't want to put this one back in. And now I'm going to take my nice, shiny, new, unwarped busk here, take the loop side, and find the correct place to put it. There's a couple of seam allowances here and you want them in between the seam allowances, otherwise you won't be able to get the loops through the hole. Feel around. Here we go. So shove those in place. All right, and this one is ready to sew. So here's the old busk being removed. And here's the new undamaged busk going in. Sorry, it was a little bit difficult to see before, but the old busk obviously has the broken busk pin. And so now that that's in, that will be held in place by the punctured holes, so I don't have to pin that side in. And both sides are ready to be sewn in place now. So here I'm using my zipper foot or cording foot, so I get right up next to the busk when I'm sewing. And once I finish putting in the anchor seams for both sides of the busk, I change my foot to my regular foot and I sew back in the boning channels for that adjacent flat steel bone by the busk. I could do this with my old foot, but I prefer the normal foot because I think it's easier to see where the old seam was, so I can go right on top of it. And once that's finished, I can slip in those bones again, and of course they fit perfectly. And the busk fits awesome. So the last thing we need to do is just to sew on the binding again. Now the binding was sewn on with a very short stitch, and so there was actually quite a bit of damage to the binding when I had removed it. There was quite a bit of fraying. So I ended up hand finishing the binding and sewing it in the back by hand. and this is the final result. So the last thing I need to do is just put in the laces here. But nice shiny new busk, unbroken here, and the binding went on okay. When I was removing the binding, I didn't realize how short of a stitch length they used, and they knotted it. They like went over the top, the very edge of that quite a few times. So the binding ended up being damaged as I undid all that stitching, and there was a lot of fraying. So instead of machine stitching the very back of this, I actually ended up having to hand stitch it. So not my neatest work, but at least I was able to get the top and bottom edges to match up, not show any fraying coming out from behind the corset or anything, so it looks tidy when it's completely done up. When the corset is being worn, it still looks clean from the front. Top and bottom edges match up when it's being worn on the body. So that is it. This just needs laces and to use like a little lint roller on it. And here's the close-up of the new busk. So thank you so much for watching. If you end up using this tutorial and replacing a broken busk in your corset, leave a comment down below and let me know how it works out for you. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next week for another video. Bye.